On the 16th of July, 1969, a Soviet radar tracking officer named Nikolai Vasilievich Kraskov stood in a windowless bunker 60 miles south of Moscow, watching a phosphorescent trace crawl across his screen with impossible slowness. He had tracked American launches before, countless Atlas and Titan missions arcing into orbit with predictable trajectories that Soviet analysts could plot within minutes. This trace was different. The return signal indicated a mass so large that Kraskov initially suspected equipment malfunction, a reflection error amplified by atmospheric distortion, or perhaps electromagnetic interference from the storm systems moving across the Baltic. He called his supervisor over, a veteran officer who had monitored American missile tests since the late 1950s, a man who could estimate payload mass from radar cross-section and acceleration curves with remarkable accuracy. The supervisor studied the screen for 40 seconds without speaking, then picked up the red telephone that connected directly to the analysis center at Kaliningrad. Within 90 minutes, 3 separate tracking stations confirmed what Kraskov had observed: a launch vehicle that had inserted more than 260,000 pounds into low Earth orbit in a single flight, a mass greater than anything the Soviet Union could lift even across multiple launches with their most powerful operational rocket. The Americans had not incrementally improved their heavy lift capability. They had shattered every assumption Soviet engineers held about the physical limits of chemical propulsion, and they had done it with a rocket so large it should not have been possible to construct, much less fly successfully on its first crewed mission. The mass advantage was not theoretical or marginal. It represented a fundamental asymmetry in industrial capacity that Soviet planners had not anticipated and could not immediately counter. American engineers had designed the Saturn V to place 310,000 pounds into low Earth orbit, a figure that Soviet designers initially dismissed as propaganda when they first encountered it in Western technical journals in 1966. The N-1 rocket, the Soviet Union's answer to the Saturn V, was designed to lift only 209,000 pounds to the same orbit, fully 100,000 pounds less than the American system. That difference was not a matter of minor efficiency improvements or refined propellant chemistry. It reflected a gap in manufacturing precision, material science, engine clustering technology, and systems integration that would take the Soviet Union more than a decade to close, assuming they devoted unlimited resources to the problem. The Saturn V's first stage alone generated 7.6 million pounds of thrust from 5 F1 engines, each producing 1.5 million pounds of thrust with a chamber pressure that Soviet metallurgists considered dangerously high for sustained operation. Soviet engineers had achieved higher chamber pressures in experimental engines, but never in operational systems that had to function reliably across multiple missions with human crews aboard, and never at the scale the Americans were demonstrating with apparent ease. Before 1969, Soviet confidence in their space program rested on a foundation of genuine achievement that was difficult for Western observers to dismiss. They had launched the first satellite, sent the first human into orbit, conducted the first spacewalk, and achieved the first soft landing on another celestial body. Sergei Korolev, the brilliant chief designer who had guided the Soviet program through its early triumphs, had died in January of 1966 during routine surgery, a loss that removed the one individual capable of coordinating the fractious design bureaus that competed for resources and prestige within the Soviet system. But even after Korolev's death, Soviet planners believed they understood American capabilities with reasonable accuracy. They knew the Americans had larger rockets, better computers, and more money. But they assumed the gap was manageable, that Soviet ingenuity and theoretical strength in physics and mathematics could compensate for limitations in manufacturing precision and materials quality. The Saturn V's successful demonstration on Apollo 8 in December of 1968, carrying humans around the Moon and back with a total mission mass exceeding 80,000 pounds beyond Earth orbit, destroyed that assumption completely. No combination of existing Soviet rockets could deliver that much mass to lunar trajectory, not even if they launched multiple missions and attempted orbital assembly, a technique that introduced cascading risks of docking failures, propellant boil-off, and systems incompatibility. The strategic implications extended far beyond the moon race. If the Americans could routinely lift 310,000 pounds to orbit, they could deploy space stations of unprecedented size, construct orbital weapons platforms that Soviet systems could not match, and establish surveillance satellites with resolution and coverage that would render Soviet camouflage and concealment efforts largely ineffective. The payload capacity also meant the Americans could include redundant systems, additional fuel reserves, and more sophisticated electronics, without making the agonizing trade-offs that characterized every Soviet space mission. Yuri Semenov, a young engineer working on the Soyuz program in 1969, later recalled the mood in the design bureaus after Apollo 11's successful landing. The mood was not defeat exactly, he said in an interview conducted in 1998, but rather a kind of stunned realization that the Americans had solved problems Soviet engineers were still trying to formulate correctly. The Saturn V did not just work. It worked with margins of safety and performance that suggested the Americans understood combustion dynamics, structural loading, and vibration suppression at a level Soviet theory had not predicted was possible. The story of how America achieved this overwhelming advantage in heavy lift capability begins not with a single breakthrough but with a series of institutional decisions made between 1958 and 1961 that shaped the entire trajectory of the Apollo program. When President Eisenhower established NASA in October of 1958, he deliberately structured it as a civilian agency with direct access to military research, defense contractors, and university laboratories, creating a hybrid organization that could draw on the best capabilities of each sector without being constrained by military procurement rules or academic pace. Wernher von Braun, the German rocket engineer who had developed the V-2 during World War II and then led the Army's ballistic missile program at Huntsville, Alabama, transferred to NASA in 1960 along with his entire team and the facilities at what would become the Marshall Space Flight Center. Von Braun brought not just technical knowledge, but a design philosophy that prioritized reliability through conservative margins, extensive ground testing, and incremental scaling of proven concepts. He had argued since the mid-1950s that a moon mission would require a rocket with at least 6 million pounds of thrust, a figure that most American engineers considered excessive until detailed trajectory studies confirmed that anything less would force unacceptable compromises in mission architecture. President Kennedy's decision in May of 1961 to commit the United States to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade transformed von Braun's theoretical advocacy into funded reality. The Apollo program received an initial appropriation of $549 million in fiscal year 1962, a figure that would grow to $5.9 billion by 1966, at the program's peak consuming more than 4% of the entire federal budget. That level of funding allowed NASA to pursue what engineers called the all-up testing philosophy, building flight-ready hardware from the start rather than incrementally testing individual stages, a strategy that compressed the development timeline but required extraordinary confidence in design calculations and manufacturing quality. The decision to pursue lunar orbit rendezvous rather than direct ascent or Earth orbit rendezvous meant the Saturn V would not need to lift the full mass of the return vehicle to the lunar surface, reducing the required payload capacity from over 400,000 pounds to approximately 310,000 pounds for low Earth orbit, with 45,000 pounds deliverable to lunar orbit. That was still far more than any existing rocket could manage, but it was theoretically achievable with 5 engines of the size von Braun's team was designing at Rocketdyne in California. The F1 engine that powered the Saturn V's first stage represented the largest single technical gamble in the Apollo program. Each engine stood 19 feet tall, weighed 18,400 pounds, and consumed 3 tons of propellant per second at full thrust. The turbopump that fed liquid oxygen into the combustion chamber spun at 5,500 revolutions per minute and generated 55,000 horsepower, more than the combined output of all 3 engines on a Boeing 727 airliner. Rocketdyne began development work on the F1 in January of 1959, initially targeting 1 million pounds of thrust, but NASA increased the requirement to 1.5 million pounds in 1961. When trajectory studies revealed that the originally planned 4-engine cluster would not provide adequate performance margins. Scaling up combustion chamber size created unpredictable instabilities, pressure waves that could build in milliseconds and tear an engine apart before automatic shutdown systems could respond. Rocketdyne engineers spent 2 years testing injector plate designs, trying configurations with thousands of holes drilled at different angles to mix fuel and oxidizer in patterns that would resist oscillation even under maximum Mertist. They destroyed 43 combustion chambers during instability testing, deliberately triggering failures with small explosive charges to understand how disturbances propagated through the combustion zone, and how quickly the engine could damp out developing oscillation. Soviet engineers, working on the Mk-15 engine for the N-1, faced identical combustion instability problems, but without the manufacturing infrastructure to implement the solutions. Rocketdyne had developed through expensive trial and error. The NK-15 produced 385,000 pounds of thrust, less than a quarter of the F-1's output, which meant the N-1's first stage required 30 engines clustered in 2 concentric rings to achieve adequate thrust. Clustering multiplied the points of failure and created a nightmare of vibration coupling where oscillations in one engine could trigger sympathetic responses in adjacent engines, potentially cascading into structural failure. Valentin Glushko, the Soviet Union's leading engine designer, had advocated for fewer, larger engines burning hypergolic propellants that ignited on contact and eliminated the need for complex ignition sequences. But Glushko and Korolev had clashed repeatedly over design philosophy, their personal animosity dating back to the 1930s when both had been imprisoned during Stalin's purges. After Korolev's death, his successor Vasily Mishin continued the N-1 program with the NK-15 engine cluster, despite mounting evidence that the technical risks were unmanageable with available resources and testing time. The Saturn V's first unmanned test flight, Apollo 4, launched from Kennedy Space Center on the 9th of November 1967, carrying a mass simulator that brought the total vehicle weight to 6.2 million pounds at liftoff. Engineers at the Marshall Space Flight Center had calculated that the acoustic energy from the 5 F-1 engines at full thrust would exceed 170 decibels at ground level, sufficient to cause permanent hearing damage at ranges up to 3 miles and potentially crack glass in buildings 5 miles away. They constructed a flame trench beneath the launch pad that channeled exhaust horizontally and built a water deluge system that poured 300,000 gallons per minute onto the pad's surface to absorb acoustic energy and protect the structure from thermal damage. CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, reporting from a reinforced concrete bunker 3.5 miles from the pad, watched the launch through thick protective glass that still cracked from the acoustic shock, fragments falling onto the desk in front of him as he struggled to maintain his composure on live television. The rocket worked perfectly, inserting the S-IVB third stage and Apollo spacecraft into orbit precisely on schedule, then reigniting the third stage for a high-speed re-entry test that subjected the heat shield to conditions matching a return from the moon. Soviet observers monitoring the flight from tracking stations in the Pacific noted the precision with which the Americans controlled the trajectory and the smoothness of stage separations that had to work flawlessly while the vehicle was accelerating through maximum aerodynamic pressure. The Apollo 4 mission validated the entire Saturn V design in a single test, an audacious approach that carried enormous risk but demonstrated confidence in engineering processes that Soviet designers could only envy. Traditional Soviet practice required multiple tests of each stage individually before attempting integrated flights, a methodical approach that minimized the cost of individual failures but extended development timelines and required far more test hardware. The Americans had essentially bet the entire program on their calculations being correct the first time, and the bet had paid off. Pavel Tsybin, a Soviet test pilot and engineer who observed the Apollo 4 launch from a diplomatic post in Washington, later wrote that the most impressive aspect was not the size of the rocket but the apparent ease with which the Americans operated it, as if lifting 6 million pounds off the ground required no more effort than their routine satellite launches. The second all-up test, Apollo 6 on the 4th of April, 1968, exposed the dangers in NASA's aggressive schedule. 2 of the 5 F-1 engines shut down early due to severe longitudinal oscillations, a phenomenon engineers called pogo because the effect resembled a pogo stick bouncing up and down. The remaining 3 engines burned longer to compensate, successfully placing the vehicle in orbit, but revealing a potentially catastrophic flaw that had not appeared in ground tests. Engineers traced the problem to pressure oscillations in the liquid oxygen feed lines that coupled with the vehicle's natural structural frequencies, creating a feedback loop that increased in amplitude until engine thrust dropped below acceptable limits, and automatic cutoff systems activated. The solution required installing helium gas accumulators in the feed lines to damp pressure waves, a relatively simple fix once the mechanism was understood, but one that could have destroyed a crewed mission if it had not been discovered during unmanned testing. Soviet engineers reading Western technical journals noticed that NASA published detailed accounts of the pogo problem and its solution, a transparency that was unthinkable in the Soviet system where failures were classified and designers often repeated mistakes made by rival bureaus because information sharing was restricted. Apollo 8's flight around the moon in December of 1968 carried 3 astronauts on a mission that NASA had originally planned as an Earth orbital test of the lunar module. When the lunar module fell behind schedule, NASA made the bold decision to send the crew to the moon. Moon without it, relying on the Saturn V and the Apollo Command and Service modules to execute a profile that allowed almost no margin for error. Launch weight was 596,000 pounds, with the S-IVB third stage executing a flawless translunar injection burn that accelerated the spacecraft to 25,000 miles per hour, fast enough to escape Earth's gravity and coast to the Moon along a precisely calculated trajectory. Mission controllers in Houston monitored every parameter continuously, but once the spacecraft left Earth orbit, the crew was essentially on their own for any emergency that required immediate response. The service propulsion engine had to fire perfectly on the far side of the Moon to slow the spacecraft into lunar orbit, an operation that occurred while Apollo 8 was out of radio contact with Earth. If the engine failed to ignite or burned with insufficient thrust, the spacecraft would swing past the Moon and into solar orbit with no possibility of rescue. If it burned too long, the spacecraft would crash into the lunar surface. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders executed the burn precisely, becoming the first humans to orbit another world, while Soviet controllers tracked their mission from ground stations and tried to calculate how the Americans had solved the navigation and thermal control problems that still plagued Soviet deep space programs. The psychological impact of Apollo 8's success on Soviet space planners was profound and immediate. They had believed their own circumlunar program, using a Soyuz spacecraft launched on the Proton rocket, would achieve a crewed lunar flyby before the Americans. Technical problems with the Proton's upper stage and the Soyuz spacecraft's re-entry system had forced repeated delays, and now the Americans had not merely flown around the Moon, but had orbited it with 3 crew members, conducted detailed photography of potential landing sites, and returned safely with margins that suggested routine operations rather than desperate gambling. At a meeting of the State Commission for Space Exploration in January of 1969, Vasily Mishin acknowledged that the N-1 rocket's development was at least 2 years behind schedule, and that even if the next test flight succeeded, the Soviet Union could not hope to land cosmonauts on the Moon before 1971 at the earliest. The Americans had demonstrated they could do it now, today, with hardware that was already operational and crews that had proven they could execute complex mission profiles under conditions that allowed minimal ground support. Apollo 11's Saturn V, designated AS-506, rolled out to Launch Complex 39A on the 20th of May, 1969, carried on a crawler transporter that moved at 1 mile per hour across a gravel roadway, specially designed to support the combined weight of rocket, mobile launch platform, and transporter, more than 18 million pounds moving as a single integrated unit. The vehicle stood 363 feet tall, taller than a 30-story building, with a base diameter of 33 feet that tapered to the Apollo spacecraft's narrow escape tower at the top. Fully fueled, the rocket would weigh 6.5 million pounds, 85% of which was propellant, that would be consumed in the first 11 minutes of flight. The first stage alone carried 203,400 gallons of RP-1 kerosene and 331,000 gallons of liquid oxygen, the oxidizer boiling continuously at -297 degrees Fahrenheit and requiring constant replenishment up to the moment of launch. 5 F-1 engines protruded from the base, their bells 19 feet in diameter and designed to expand exhaust gases from chamber pressure of 960 pounds per square inch to near vacuum at the exit plane, extracting maximum possible thrust from every pound of propellant burn. The launch on the 16th of July 1969 occurred at 9:32 in the morning Eastern Time, witnessed by an estimated 1 million people gathered along beaches and causeways around Cape Canaveral. Soviet tracking stations began monitoring the telemetry stream, seconds after liftoff, recording acceleration rates, propellant flow rates, and trajectory parameters that confirmed the vehicle was performing exactly as predicted. The first stage burned for 2 minutes and 41 seconds, consuming nearly 5 million pounds of propellant and accelerating the vehicle to 6,170 miles per hour before shutting down at an altitude of 42 miles. 8 small solid rocket motors fired to push the spent first stage away from the accelerating upper stages, a separation that had to occur cleanly to prevent collision or damage to the interstage structure. The second stage, powered by 5 J-2 engines burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, ignited immediately and continued the acceleration toward orbital velocity. Soviet radar operators noted that the trajectory was slightly flatter than earlier Apollo missions, optimized for the specific orbital mechanics of the July 16th launch window that aligned Earth's rotation with the Moon's position for maximum efficiency. 11 minutes and 42 seconds after launch, the Saturn V's third stage shut down after its first burn, inserting the complete Apollo spacecraft into a parking orbit 98 by 103 miles high. The crew, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, spent the next 2 hours and 44 minutes checking spacecraft systems and preparing for the critical translunar injection burn that would commit them to the moon landing attempt. Soviet analysts calculating the orbital parameters knew that the spacecraft in orbit weighed approximately 260,000 pounds, a figure that included the S-IVB third stage, the Apollo Command and Service modules, the lunar module, and the spacecraft lunar module adapter that connected them. That mass represented the largest payload ever placed in orbit by a single launch, exceeding the total mass of all Soviet satellites launched in the entire year of 1968. When the S-IVB reignited for 5 minutes and 48 seconds to accelerate the spacecraft toward the moon, the burn added 5,840 miles per hour to the velocity, enough to climb out of Earth's gravity well and coast to lunar orbit, along a trajectory that required only small mid-course corrections. The N-1 rocket's first test launch on the 21st of February, 1969, ended in disaster after 69 seconds of flight when a propellant line ruptured in one of the 30 NK-15 engines, triggering automatic shutdown of the affected engine and its opposite number in the symmetrical cluster. The remaining 28 engines continued firing, but the loss of thrust on one side created a yaw moment that the control system could not fully compensate. The rocket began tumbling, broke apart under aerodynamic loads, and fell back to the launch site at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. Investigators examining the wreckage found that a loose bolt, left in a propellant line during assembly, had been ingested into a turbo pump where it caused catastrophic failure within seconds. The accident revealed quality control problems that were systemic throughout Soviet manufacture, where workers accustomed to building robust military hardware that could tolerate minor defects struggled with the precision requirements of large rocket engines that operated at the limits of material strength and thermal capacity. The second N-1 test, on the 3rd of July, 1969, failed even more catastrophically when a software error in the control system shut down all 30 engines immediately after liftoff. The rocket, still carrying nearly full propellant load, fell back onto the launch pad and exploded with force equivalent to 7 kilotons of TNT, destroying the pad complex completely and setting back the Soviet moon program by at least 2 years. Film footage of the explosion, kept secret for more than 2 decades, showed a fireball that rose 4,000 feet into the air and scattered debris across an area of several square miles. 3 workers were killed by falling wreckage despite being stationed more than a mile from the pad. The control system failure was traced to a sensor that detected high-frequency vibrations shortly after liftoff and interpreted it as an engine explosion in progress, triggering emergency shutdown of the entire first-stage cluster, even though all engines were functioning normally. The vibration was actually caused by aerodynamic buffeting from the launch tower structure, a phenomenon that American engineers had anticipated and designed around, but that Soviet designers had not adequately tested in wind tunnels or computer simulation. American intelligence agencies learned of the N-1 failures within weeks through signals intelligence that detected emergency communications and altered launch schedules at Baikonur. CIA analysts studying satellite imagery of the Baikonur site noted that the launch pad used for N-1 tests showed signs of extensive damage consistent with a major explosion, and that reconstruction work continued for more than 18 months after the July disaster. The National Reconnaissance Office's KH-4 photographic reconnaissance satellites, flying at altitudes of 100 to 150 miles with film resolution sufficient to identify vehicles and large equipment, captured images of the N-1 assembly building and launch complex that allowed American analysts to estimate the rocket's dimensions and infer its performance capabilities. The assessment concluded that even if the N-1 eventually flew successfully, its payload capacity would be insufficient to support a lunar landing mission as ambitious as Apollo, with its separate lunar module, extended surface daytime, and multiple redundant systems. The Soviet leadership's response to Apollo 11's success in July of 1969 was to publicly dismiss the moon landing as a propaganda stunt, while quietly redirecting resources towards space stations and Earth orbital operations where the Soviet Union could claim continued relevance. Leonid Brezhnev, who had succeeded Nikita Khrushchev as General Secretary in 1964, made no public comment on the Apollo 11 landing for more than a week, and Soviet newspapers gave the event minimal coverage compared to the front-page celebrations that had accompanied Yuri Gagarin's flight 8 years earlier. Internal documents from the Central Committee, declassified in the 1990s, revealed bitter debates about whether to continue funding the N1 program or acknowledge defeat in the moon race and preserve resources for other priorities. The decision to continue was political rather than technical, driven by institutional momentum and the prestige of the design bureaus involved rather than any realistic assessment that the N1 could catch up to American capabilities. The Saturn V's demonstration of reliable heavy-lift capability enabled mission profiles that would have been impossible with smaller rockets. Apollo 12, launched in November of 1969, carried a lunar module that was 600 pounds heavier than Apollo 11's, allowing the crew to stay on the surface for more than 31 hours and conduct 2 moonwalks totaling more than 7.5 hours. Apollo 14 in January of 1971 included a portable handcart that astronauts used to transport tools and rock samples across the lunar surface. Equipment that added weight but significantly increased the scientific productivity of the mission. Apollo Quints through 17 carried the Lunar Roving Vehicle, a battery-powered car that weighed 460 pounds and allowed astronauts to explore areas several miles from the landing site. The rover, with its crew and equipment, added approximately 1,500 pounds to the lunar module's landing weight, an increment that was only possible because the Saturn V provided generous margins throughout the mission profile. Soviet engineers monitoring the later Apollo missions noted that the Americans appeared to be operating with comfortable reserves, launching in poor weather, conducting complex orbital maneuvers, and extending mission timelines without the constant anxiety about consumables and systems degradation that characterized Soviet spaceflights. Apollo 13's successful return after an oxygen tank explosion in April of 1970 demonstrated that the spacecraft had sufficient redundancy and reserve capacity to survive a crippling failure and still bring the crew home safely. A level of reliability that was only possible because the Saturn V could lift enough mass to include backup systems for critical functions. The Soviet Soyuz spacecraft, launched on much smaller rockets, had no such margins. Every kilogram had to be justified, every system pared down to minimum functionality, and cosmonauts flew knowing that certain types of failures would be unsurvivable because there was simply no room for the equipment needed to handle contingency. The final N1 test on the 23rd of November 1972 achieved more than 100 seconds of powered flight before a failure in the first stage propellant distribution system caused multiple engines to shut down. The rocket's control system managed to shut down the remaining engines in an orderly sequence, and the vehicle impacted downrange from the launch site rather than falling back onto the pad. But the test still represented a failure to achieve orbit and demonstrated that the fundamental problems with engine clustering and control system reliability had not been solved despite 3 years of additional development work. Valentin Glushko, who became head of the Consolidated Soviet Space Design Bureau in 1974 after Mishin was removed, cancelled the N1 program in 1974 and ordered all flight hardware and tooling destroyed to free up resources for his own heavy-lift design, the Energia rocket, that would not fly until 1987. The decision meant that the Soviet Union would have no heavy-lift capability at all for more than a decade, ceding an entire class of space missions to the Americans and accepting a strategic disadvantage that would persist through the 1980s. The Saturn V flew 13 times between November of 1967 and May of 1973. Every launch successful, every mission achieving its primary objectives. The final flight carried Skylab, America's first space station, a facility that weighed 170,000 pounds, more than the entire mass of the International Space Station's first module, launched 30 years later. Skylab was actually a converted S-IVB third stage, the same component that had pushed Apollo's spacecraft toward the moon. Now fitted out with living quarters, scientific instruments, and life support systems for crews of 3, who would occupy the station for missions lasting up to 84 days. The fact that the Americans could launch a fully equipped space station in a single flight, ready for immediate occupancy, demonstrated the same industrial and engineering superiority that had taken them to the moon. Soviet space stations were assembled gradually from smaller modules launched separately, a more flexible prefix that reduced the requirements for any single launch but that also increased complexity and introduced multiple failure points. American engineers who worked on the Saturn V program later reflected that the rocket's success was never inevitable, that dozens of critical decisions made during development could have gone differently and led to failure, Jerry Thompson, a structural engineer at Marshall Space Flight Center, recalled in a 1998 oral history that the decision to use a common bulkhead separating the liquid oxygen and RP-1 tanks in the first stage was intensely controversial because it placed cryogenic oxidizer just inches from room temperature fuel, separated only by a thin aluminum structure that had to be both strong enough to support the loads and insulated enough to prevent the liquid oxygen from freezing the fuel. The common bulkhead saved 15,000 pounds of structural weight compared to separate tank walls, weight that translated directly into additional payload capacity. But it also created a potential failure mode that did not exist with conventional tank design. The fact that the common bulkhead worked flawlessly through 13 flights represented both excellent engineering and a certain amount of luck that Soviet designers, working with less precise manufacturing and tighter budgets, could not rely upon. The Apollo program cost $25.4 billion between 1960 and 1973, equivalent to approximately $130 billion in 2020 inflation-adjusted terms. That investment bought not just 12 men on the moon, but an entire infrastructure of manufacturing capability, systems engineering expertise, and institutional knowledge that would support American space programs for the next 50 years. The Soviet Union spent roughly equivalent resources on its lunar program across the same period, but distributed the money across multiple competing design bureaus, and frequently cancelled projects mid-development, when political priorities shifted or technical problems proved intractable. The result was that Soviet engineers reinvented solutions to problems the Americans had already solved, wasted resources on rockets that never flew, and failed to develop the kind of systematic testing and quality control processes that made American rockets reliable enough for human spaceflight. By the mid-1970s, the asymmetry in heavy lift capability had become a permanent feature of the Cold War space competition. The Americans had proven they could routinely deliver payloads exceeding 100,000 pounds to orbit, could send humans beyond Earth orbit and bring them back safely, and could conduct complex orbital operations that required precise navigation, reliable life support, and extensive ground support networks. The Soviet Union had proven they could match American achievements in Earth orbit, could operate long-duration space stations, and could develop sophisticated robotic spacecraft for planetary exploration. But they could not match the Saturn V's payload capacity, could not support lunar missions with margins sufficient to ensure crew safety, and could not overcome the institutional and manufacturing limitations that made their large rockets less reliable than American equivalents. The strategic consequences of this asymmetry extended beyond the space program itself into military planning and arms control negotiations. If the Americans could lift 310,000 pounds to orbit, they could theoretically deploy orbital weapons platforms, anti-satellite systems, or reconnaissance satellites of such size and sophistication that ground-based defenses would be largely ineffective. The fact that the United States chose not to weaponize space as aggressively as Soviet planners feared was a political decision, not a technical limitation. Soviet military planners developing defenses against orbital threats had to assume American capabilities that exceeded demonstrated performance by substantial margins, because the Saturn V's existence proved that American heavy-lift technology was far more advanced than Soviet analysts had predicted. Every negotiation about strategic arms limitations had to account for the possibility that the Americans could rapidly deploy space-based systems if they chose to abandon treaty restrictions, a threat that gave the United States leverage in areas far removed from the Apollo program's original purpose. The engineers and technicians who built the Saturn V came from hundreds of contractors across the United States, from Boeing in Seattle that built the first stage, to North American Aviation in California that built the second stage, to Douglas Aircraft that built the third stage, to IBM that designed the guidance computer. The integration of components manufactured in different facilities by different companies, each using their own quality control processes and engineering standards, required systems engineering at a level of sophistication that had never been attempted before. George Mueller, NASA's Associate Administrator for Manned Spaceflight from 1963 to 1969, imposed strict interface control documents that specified exactly how each component would connect to adjacent systems, what test data contractors had to provide, and how changes to one component would be evaluated for impact on the entire vehicle. This systematic approach, borrowed from Air Force ballistic missile programs, allowed NASA to maintain configuration control over hardware being built simultaneously in multiple locations, and to verify that everything would work together before expensive integration tests began. Soviet design bureaus operated with far less coordination, each jealously guarding technical information and competing for resources and prestige within a system that rewarded self-promotion more than collaboration. When problems occurred with interfaces between systems developed by different bureaus, resolution required intervention from ministerial authorities who often lacked technical expertise and made decisions based on political considerations, rather than engineering merit. American engineers visiting Soviet facilities after the Cold War ended were stunned by the high quality of individual components and subsystems, but also by the lack of systematic integration testing and the absence of detailed documentation that would allow one team to understand exactly what another team had built. The legacy of the Saturn V extended decades beyond the end of the Apollo program. When NASA began developing the Space Shuttle in the 1970s, engineers studied Saturn V design documents extensively to understand how von Braun's team had achieved such remarkable reliability. The shuttle's main engines used many of the combustion chamber and turbopump design principles developed for the J-2 engines that powered the Saturn V's upper stages. When the Soviet Union finally developed the Energia rocket in the 1980s, capable of lifting 125,000 pounds to low Earth orbit, Soviet engineers acknowledged they had learned from studying published American technical papers about the Saturn V's propulsion systems, structural design, and control systems. The Energia flew successfully only twice before the Soviet Union collapsed and funding for the program ended. But those two flights demonstrated that Soviet engineers could eventually master the same technologies that had made the Saturn V successful, given enough time and resources. Today, more than 50 years after the last Saturn V launch, no rocket has ever matched its payload capacity to the Moon. The Space Launch System that NASA is developing for the Artemis program is designed to exceed Saturn V's performance by about 15%. But that increment required completely new engine designs, advanced composite materials, and computer-controlled manufacturing techniques that were not available in the 1960s. The fact that it took half a century to surpass the Saturn V's capabilities speaks to both the remarkable achievement that von Braun's team accomplished and the unique convergence of political will, financial resources, and technical talent that made the Apollo program possible. Soviet engineers, working under different constraints with different priorities, built remarkable machines that accomplish objectives their leadership valued, but they never matched the systematic excellence and industrial capacity that allowed Americans to send 12 men to the Moon and bring all of them home safely. The 310,000 pounds that the Saturn V could lift to low Earth orbit was not just a number, it was a measure of national capability, of industrial capacity, of engineering confidence, and of willingness to invest vast resources in pursuit of objectives that were strategic rather than immediately practical. Soviet leaders who believed they could match American achievements through ingenuity and determination discovered that some advantages were simply insurmountable without remaking their entire industrial and institutional system. The Americans had built not just a rocket, but an entire infrastructure of precision manufacturing, quality control, systematic testing, and transparent documentation that allowed complex systems to work reliably under conditions where failure meant certain death for the crews involved. That infrastructure, more than any single technical innovation, was what the Soviet Union could never replicate. And its absence explains why Nikolai Vasilievich Kraskov's radar trace in July of 1969 showed a mass in orbit that Soviet rockets could not match even a decade later. If this documentary helped you understand why American technological superiority in the Cold War space race represented more than just bigger rockets and larger budgets, subscribe to this channel for more stories about the systems, decision, and individuals that shaped the outcome of the Cold War through industrial capacity and engineering excellence that changed what humanity believed was possible.